If this is your first visit to the center, we hope you'll look around, and if you want to find out other things that are going on here, you can look at our website on uchicago.in, or you can put your name on our mailing list at using the computer on the front desk or on the website. My name is Gary Taub. I'm the faculty director at the center, and so I have the very happy task of telling you how delighted we are to have such a great event under such auspicious sponsorship. And of course, we're always glad to have any excuse to have Martha Nussbaum here, who, among the very many things that she does at the University of Chicago, happens also to be a member of the faculty steering committee for the UChicago Center in Delhi. So we think of this as a kind of homecoming for her. And my policy on these interesting events that we have is to let them take place without delay. So rather than saying any more, for the purpose of introducing our speaker, I'll turn things over to Ananta.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome again. I'm going to have a very raspy voice, and it seems like it's now become a permanent voice, one of the externalities of Delhi's pollution. But many of my colleagues say it's a positive externality. It's a much nicer voice than what I had before. That's what they say. So I'll learn to live with that. We're very happy and delighted to have this co-hosted with the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. It made absolute sense to do this. And when Martha very graciously agreed to come and give this presentation, we just jumped on it, and I'm very happy to have this. I want to say a little bit about this MGIP. It's a mouthful, the name itself. It's the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. It's UNESCO's newest baby. They have about 12 institutes around the world, but this is the first one in Asia Pacific. And you see from the name, the mandate, it's got 4 key terms. 3 are in the name and 1 is missing. It's an education. We don't do teaching, but it's primarily focused on pedagogies. And then it's on education for peace, sustainable development, and the one which is missing that we have put it on is this whole notion of global citizenship. And surprisingly, the UN has actually taken that on quite seriously. They've managed to get through the member states with this concept of global citizenship. So that's a feat by itself. So it was inaugurated by the President of India and the Director General of UNESCO in 2012, but we basically started operations only in June 2014. So very young. But as you can see, we have already had, this is the 3rd distinguished lecture. And we intend to be very active and making an impact. So that's so come and visit us on our website. But we are in the center of the city at 35 Feroz Shah Road, so do visit us. Now today we are honored and delighted to welcome Professor Martha Nussbaum to Delhi. I met Professor Nussbaum sometime in early 2000s, so not for very long, but we were involved in setting up this association, the Human Development and Capability Association with Amartya Sen. And I still remember the very nice, pleasant time we had in Pavia, the Italian city where we actually was formally launched the HDCA. And we continue to work on the editorial board, and Martha, of course, will be steering the journal as well. I'm not going to spend some time talking about all the achievements and works of Martha Nussbaum, then that would be a lecture by itself. And it'll take more than a day. So I'm going to refrain from them, but she's a luminary, as we all know, field of philosophy, law, justice. So it spans across disciplines. And even the economists listen to her, and that's a feat. Her foundational work on capabilities has been instrumental, and I think it has had an impact on policy. Because even if not directly, if I look at how the governments have been developing these sustainable development goals, I see some of that work reflected there. For the first time, they have justice in the goals. Might be a bit fuzzy, but at least the word is there. So it's a first start. People are criticizing on measuring it, but at least it's there in an international goal. So I'm kind of optimistic about that. This title is, I think, very appropriate. I think builds on her seminal books, the ones I thought were extremely relevant to the contemporary problems we have, the fragility of goodness and the disgust to humanity. The title she comes up with are very provocative and something that compels one to read. And so anger and revolutionary justice follows in that tradition. So I'm very excited. And thank you for accepting this invitation. And I give the podium to you, Mark.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming here. It's very exciting to me to be lecturing in this University of Chicago Center, which I had a hand in working with the architects and on the design committee of, and it's just lovely to be able to speak in it and see it filled with people. And I want to thank Anantha and the Gandhi Institute particularly for inviting me, because as you'll see, this lecture records what I've learned from Gandhi and learned to actually change quite a few of the views that I've expressed in print in the past. So without further ado. Anger, as we all know, can be very ugly and very destructive. And yet, with all its ugliness, it's a very popular emotion. Many people think it's impossible to care for justice without anger at injustice, and that anger should be encouraged as part of the transformative process. Many also believe that it's impossible for individuals to stand up for their self-respect without anger, and that someone who reacts to wrongs and insults without anger is spineless and downtrodden. Women, in particular, are often urged to tap into our own alleged inner anger and to see this search for suppressed anger as part of a personal struggle for self-respect. Moreover, many people also believe that getting angry when someone else wrongs you is essential to taking that person seriously. So, for example, if you wrong me and I don't get angry at you, I'm treating you contemptuously, as though you're a child or a non-responsible person. Nor are these ideas confined to the sphere of personal relations. The most popular position in the sphere of criminal justice, both theoretical and practical, is retributivism. That is, the view that the law must punish aggressors in a manner that embodies the spirit of justified anger. And it's also very widely believed that successful challenges against great injustice need the spirit of anger to make progress. So anger's at the heart of revolutionary transformation. Still, we might think again, thinking about the fact that recent years have seen 3 noble and successful freedom movements conducted in a spirit of non-anger, those of Mohandas Gandhi, of Martin Luther King Jr., and of Nelson Mandela. Surely people who stood up for their self-respect and that of others, and who did not acquiesce in injustice. Notice that I'm saying not nonviolence, I'm saying non-anger, because Gandhi also espoused pretty total nonviolence. King was more mixed. He granted that violence in self-defense was acceptable, only just not useful in his revolutionary movement. Mandela, of course, turned from nonviolence to violence for his own strategic purposes when nonviolence had failed. But he always unswervingly held to non-anger, and I'm going to return to that distinction later. So what I'm going to try to argue today is that a close philosophical analysis of the emotion of anger can help us to support these philosophies of non-anger, showing why anger is fatally flawed from a normative viewpoint. In some cases, incoherent, and in other cases based upon bad values, but in either case of dubious value in both life and the law. So I'll present my general view and then try to show its relevance to thinking well about revolutionary justice. But first, since I love to begin with insights drawn from literature, I want to begin with Greek tragedy and with a myth about the relationship between anger and justice, which is found in Aeschylus's Oresteia, that I think will show you where I'm heading. So at the end of Aeschylus's Oresteia, two transformations take place in the archaic world of the characters. One is famous, the other often neglected. In the famous transformation, the goddess Athena introduces legal institutions to replace and terminate the seemingly endless cycle of blood vengeance, setting up a court of law with established procedures of reasoned argument and the weighing of evidence, and a jury selected from all the citizens of Athens. She announces that blood guilt will from now on be settled by law rather than by the Furies, who are the ancient goddesses of revenge. But, and this is part and parcel of her famous transformation of the Athenian community, the Furies are not simply sent away. Instead, Athena persuades them to join the city and gives them a place of honor beneath the earth in recognition of their importance for these same legal institutions and the health of the city. Typically, this move of Athena's is taken to be an acknowledgement that law must incorporate the dark retributive passions and honor them. The suggestion is that the passions themselves remain unchanged. They simply have a new house built around them. They agree to accept the constraints of law, but they retain their original nature, dark and vindictive. That reading, however, ignores the second transformation, a transformation in the nature and the demeanor of the Furies themselves. At the outset of the drama, the Furies are described as repulsive and horrifying. They're said to be black and disgusting. Their eyes drip a hideous blood. Apollo even says that they're vomiting up clots of blood that they've ingested from their victims. And he says that they belong in some barbarian tyranny that doesn't know about the rule of law. Nor, when they awaken, do the Furies give the lie to these grim descriptions. When Clytemnestra's ghost calls them, they don't even speak. They just moan and whine, noises that are characteristic of animals. Their only words later, when they wake up a little bit more, are, "Get him, get him, get him, get him, get him," which is as close to a predator's hunting cry as the genre allows. As Clytemnestra says, "In your dream, you pursue your prey, and you bark like a hunting dog, hot on the trail of blood." If the Furies are later given articulate speech, as of course the genre demands, we're never to forget this initial characterization. What Aeschylus has done here is to depict unbridled resentment. It is obsessive, destructive, existing only to inflict pain and ill. As a much later philosopher, the distinguished 18th century philosopher Bishop Butler observes, "No other principle or passion hath for its end the misery of our fellow creatures." Apollo's idea is the same idea, that this rabid breed really doesn't belong in the city. It belongs in some society that does not try to moderate cruelty and not in one that claims to be civilized. Unchanged, then, these Furies could not be part and parcel of a working legal system in a society committed to the rule of law. You don't put wild dogs in a cage and come out with justice. But the Furies do not make the transition to democracy unchanged. Until quite late in the drama, they're still their bestial selves, threatening to disgorge their venom on the land. Then, however, Athena persuades them to alter themselves so as to join her enterprise. "Lull to repose the bitter force of your black wave of anger," she tells them. But of course, this means a very profound transformation, indeed a virtual change of identity, so bound up are they with anger's obsessive force. She offers them incentives to join the city, a place of honor beneath the earth, reverence from the citizens, but the condition of this honor is that they become fully human, not totally taken up with revenge, but able to adopt a new range of sentiments, in particular, benevolent and compassionate sentiments toward the entire city. They must also refrain, she says, from stirring up anger within it. So the deal is that if they change their sentiments, then they will receive good treatment and be honored. Most fundamentally transformative of all, they must listen to the voice of persuasion. All of this, needless to say, is not just external containment, it's a profound inner reorientation. They accept her offer, and they express themselves, as she puts it, with gentle-tempered intent. Each, they declare now, should give generously to each in what now the Furies themselves refer to as a mindset of common love. Not surprisingly, they seem to be transformed physically in related ways. They apparently assume an erect posture for the procession that concludes the drama, and they're said to receive crimson robes from citizen women who are their escorts. So they've become women rather than beasts, and their very name is changed. They're now the Eumenides, which means the kindly ones, rather than the Furies. Now, this second transformation, of course, is even more significant than the first one. Indeed, it's crucial to the success of the first one. Aeschylus shows that political justice does not simply put a cage around resentment, it has to fundamentally transform it from something hardly human, obsessive, bloodthirsty, to something human, accepting of reasons, calm, deliberate, and measured, something that protects life rather than threatening it. The indignation that inhabits just institutions is not an angry sentiment at all. It is measured judgment in defense of life. The Furies are still needed because this is an imperfect world and there will always be crimes to be dealt with, but they are not wanted or needed in their original shape and form. Indeed, they're not their old selves at all. They've become instruments of justice and human welfare. The city is liberated from the scourge of vindictive anger, which produces civil strife, and instead it gets forward-looking justice. So it's no accident that the major Greek philosophers who followed Aeschylus, including Socrates and all the way to the Roman philosopher Seneca, were strong opponents of retributivism in the criminal law and supporters of a welfare-based deterrent conception of punishment. Another liberation goes unexplored but invites our imaginations. It is the liberation of the private realm. In the old world of the Furies, the family and love, familial and friendly, were constantly burdened by the need to avenge something on behalf of somebody. The need for retaliation was unending, and it shadowed all relationships. Revenge really made it impossible for anyone to love anyone. But now law takes over the task of dealing with crime, leaving the family free to be a place of reciprocal goodwill. It's not that there are no more occasions for anger, but if they're serious, they're turned over to the law, and if they're not serious, why should they long trouble reciprocal concern? As Aristotle will later say, a gentle-tempered person, and that's his name for the correct virtue in the sphere of anger. The gentle-tempered person is not vengeful, but inclined to sympathetic understanding. So law gives a double benefit. It keeps us safe on the outside, and it permits us to care for one another, unburdened by angry wishes within. So that's my normative idea in a nutshell, but as I say, it's controversial and evokes strong opposition, so we have to dig more deeply. And to do so, let me begin with Aristotle's definition of anger. It's just a starting point. You'll see I don't accept all the parts of it, but it is a thread that runs through the entire Western philosophical tradition. And it turns out that it's very closely related to Gandhi's understanding of anger. So, Aristotle says that anger is an emotion that is a response to a significant damage to something or someone that one cares about, and a damage that the angry person believes to be wrongfully inflicted. He adds that although anger is itself painful, it also contains within itself a pleasant hope for payback. So, we have significant damage pertaining to one's own values or circle of cares, and we have wrongfulness. Those two elements seem both true and quite uncontroversial. And they've been validated not only by a whole lot of other philosophers, but by modern empirical psychologists who work on this emotion. More controversial, perhaps, is the idea that the angry person wants some type of retribution or payback, and that this is a conceptual part of what anger is. All the major Western philosophers who talk about anger include this wish as a conceptual element in anger, and we'll see that Gandhi does so too. But still, we need to pause because it's not obvious. Now, we should understand that the wish for payback can be a very subtle wish. The angry person doesn't need to wish to take revenge herself. She may simply want the law to do it, or, as Gandhi adds, some type of divine justice. Or she may more subtly simply want the wrongdoer's life to go very badly in the future, hoping, for example, that that second marriage of your betraying spouse will be a terrible failure. Well, I think if we understand the wish in this broad way, we see that Aristotle's right. Anger does contain a sort of strike-back tendency, and that's what differentiates it from other painful emotions like compassionate grieving. Contemporary psychologists who study anger empirically agree in seeing this double movement in it from pain to hope. An example will help. Suppose that a wrongdoer has murdered Angela's child. She does, of course, feel enormous grief and loss. But suppose she's also angry at the murderer, as she's very likely to be. What's that emotion all about? It isn't just sadness at the loss, since its focus is on the wrongfulness of the act, but still, is it just sadness that a wrongful act has occurred and a wish that it had not occurred? If that's all she feels, then I think we still wouldn't call her emotion anger. It would be a special species of grief. But then, what is it that makes her emotion anger? I think it is the wish for some type of payback, however subtle. And I will return to this, and we'll see one exception to that. Okay. But one more thing that Aristotle says at this point seems not quite right. He says that anger is always a response not to any old wrongful act, but what he calls a slighting or a down-ranking. Now, I think this doesn't seem to be true all the time. I can get angry at wrongs done to other people without thinking of them as down-rankings of me. I can even get angry at violations of principles that I care about. Still, let's hold on to Aristotle's idea, because it does cover surprisingly many cases of anger. And in fact, the empirical psychologists say that they were surprised by how many cases it does cover. And so it can help us, as we'll see, to make sense of some puzzling things that we'll get to shortly. Now we're ready to see what's normatively problematic about anger. The central issue is this: the payback idea doesn't make sense. Ideas of cosmic balance and proportionality, and almost all of us have them at some level. When wrong is done, we somehow think that the universe will be off kilter unless there's proportional rectification. The earliest piece of written Western philosophy, a fragment of the 6th century BCE philosopher Anaximander, says human justice is like the cycle of the seasons. He says the hot and the cold pay penalty to one another, each by predominating for a while and then being squeezed out promptly in their turn. Unfortunately, not soon enough in Chicago. But so this is something that people believe, that has deep roots, whether because of people's experience of the seasons or some other deep-rooted tendency. But it actually doesn't make sense in the world of human action. Whatever the wrong was that was done, a murder, a rape, a theft, inflicting pain on the wrongdoer does not in itself help restore the thing that was lost. As Aeschylus says, when a man's blood is spilt upon the ground, who can call it back again? Now, we think about payback all the time. So many of our stories are built around that idea. And it's very human to think that proportionality between punishment and offense somehow buys off or makes good the offense. Only it doesn't. Let's say that a friend of mine has actually had her own child killed, and I'll talk about a friend in this case for reasons that you'll see. Now, I urgently want that offender to be arrested, convicted, and punished. But really, what good will that do? Looking to the future, I might, as a friend, want many things: to restore my friend's life, to prevent and deter future murders. But harsh treatment of this particular wrongdoer might or might not achieve the latter goal. It's an empirical question, as Plato, rejecting Anaximander's archaic idea of punishment, already saw. And usually, people do not treat it as an empirical matter. They're in the grip of an idea of cosmic fitness that makes them think blood for blood, pain for pain is the right way to go. The payback idea is deeply human, but flawed as a way of making sense of the world. But now we can return to Aristotle's idea of down-ranking. For there's one, and I think only one, situation in which the payback idea really makes sense. And that is when I see the wrong as entirely and only a down-ranking. That is, as entirely about relative status. If the problem is not the murder itself, but the way it has somehow affected my ranking in the social hierarchy, then I can really achieve something by humiliating the wrongdoer. By putting him relatively lower, I automatically do put myself relatively higher. And since we're imagining that status is the only thing I care about, I don't need to worry that the real well-being problems created by the wrongful act have not been addressed. In short, a wronged person who is really angry, seeking to strike back, soon arrives, I claim, at 3 forks in the road. So 3 paths lie before her. Either she goes down what I'll call the path of status, seeing the event as entirely about her and her relative ranking, or second, she takes the path of payback. She focuses on payback and imagines that the offender's suffering will actually restore what was lost, a thought that doesn't make sense. Or, if she is rational, after exploring and rejecting these 2 flawed roads, she will notice that a 3rd path is open to her, which is the best of all, I think. She can focus on doing whatever would make sense in the situation and be really helpful going forward. Now, this may well include the punishment of the wrongdoer, but in a spirit that's forward-looking rather than simply retaliatory. But wait a minute, what's really wrong with the status path? Many societies, and certainly not least my own, do encourage people to think of injuries as essentially about themselves and their own relative rank. Life involves perpetual status anxiety, and more or less everything that happens to one either raises one's rank or lowers it. Aristotle's society, as he depicts it, was to a large extent also like this, and he was very critical of this tendency on the grounds that the obsessive focus on relative honor impedes the pursuit of genuine intrinsic goods. The error involved in the status path is not silly or easily dismissed, but still, the tendency to see everything that happens as about oneself and one's own relative rank, as in a kind of sports competition where we're not focusing on excellence but only on winning and losing, seems very narcissistic and ill-suited to a society in which reciprocity and justice are genuine virtues. It loses the sense that actions have intrinsic moral worth, that the murder of my friend's child is bad because of the loss of human life and the suffering it inflicts, not just because of the way it humiliates the victim and her friends. Even in the case where one is oneself the victim of a crime such as rape or assault, it somehow seems off-kilter to view rape as bad because it changes relative rank rather than because it inflicts pain and trauma. If it were primarily a relative down-ranking, it could be rectified by the humiliation of the offender. And many people certainly believe something like this. But isn't this thought a red herring, diverting us from the reality of the victim's pain and trauma, which need to be constructively addressed by attention to her? All sorts of bad acts, murder, assault, theft, need to be addressed as the specific acts they are, and their victims or the victims' families need constructive attention, none of which will be likely to happen if one thinks of the offense as all about relative status rather than injury and loss. So, to put my radical claim succinctly, When anger makes sense, its retaliatory tendency is normatively problematic because focused entirely on relative status. When it's normatively reasonable, focused on the real injury, its retaliatory tendency doesn't make sense. And it's normatively problematic in that way because we would like to make sense. For a rational person, then, anger, realizing these things, soon laughs at itself and goes away. So from now on, I'm going to call this healthy segue into constructive, forward-looking thoughts, and accordingly from anger into compassionate hope, the transition with a capital T. To clarify further what I mean by the transition, let me consider a case in which it takes a political form, thus introducing our real focus, that is the topic of transitional justice. So I want to look at just one case, the sequence of emotions in Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. King begins, indeed, with an Aristotelian summons to anger. He points to the wrongful injuries of racism, which have failed to fulfill the nation's implicit promises of justice and equality. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, quote, "The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination." The next move King makes is significant. For instead of demonizing white Americans or portraying their behavior in terms apt to elicit murderous rage, he calmly compares them to people who have defaulted on a financial obligation. Quote, "America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds." Now here's where I think the transition, capital T, begins, for it makes us think ahead in non-retributive ways. The essential question now is not how whites can be humiliated, but how can this debt be made good? And in the financial metaphor, the thought of humiliating the debtor is not likely to occur. The transition then gets underway in earnest as King focuses on a future in which all may join together in pursuing justice and honoring obligations. Quote, "But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation." End quote. So no mention again of torment or payback, only of determination to ensure the protection of civil rights at last. King reminds his audience that the moment is urgent and that there's a danger of rage spilling over, but he repudiates that behavior in advance. Quote, "In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force," which, of course, a very Gandhian phrase. So, the payback is reconfigured as vindication of civil rights, and the future is one that unites black and white in a quest for freedom and justice. Everyone will benefit. As many white people already recognize, says King, quote, "Their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom." King then repudiates a despair that could lead back again to either anger or to the abandonment of effort. It's at this point that the most famous section of the speech, the dream that often is you hear quoted, takes flight. And of course, this dream, based on the prophetic books of the Old Testament and definitely not on the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which is full of payback, it is all payback. This dream is one not of torment or retributive punishment, but of equality, liberty, and brotherhood. In pointed terms, King invites the African American members of his audience to imagine brotherhood even with their former tormentors. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words interposition and nullification, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. Now, there is indeed anger in King's speech at first, and the anger summons up a thought of rectification, which naturally takes initially a retributive form. But King gets busy right away, reshaping retributivism into work and hope. For how, sanely and really, could injustice be made good by retributive payback? The oppressor's pain and lowering do not make the afflicted free. Only an intelligent and imaginative effort toward justice can do that. So that's what I mean by the transition, a movement from anger with all its defects into forward-looking, constructive work and hope. King favored nonviolence, and so have many intelligent leaders. Sometimes, however, that strategy fails. Nelson Mandela records the gradual decision of the ANC under his leadership that violent strategies would have to be pursued for a while. But notice that while urging ANC members to follow a strategy which is usually linked to anger, and while authorizing certain sorts of violent guerrilla tactics, Mandela never failed to point to the transition, pointing people ahead to a future of cooperation rather than payback, and we'll come back to that a little later. Now, it's here that I want to introduce what I said was my one exception. That is a major exception to my thesis that anger always involves conceptually a thought of payback. There are many cases in which one gets standardly angry first, thinking about some type of payback, and then, in a cooler moment, heads for the transition, capital T. But there are at least a few cases in which one is there already. That is, the entire content of one's emotion is, how outrageous, something must be done about that. So let me call that emotion transition anger, since it is anger or sort of quasi-borderline anger, but it's already heading down the third path in Angela's road. Transition anger does not focus on status, nor does it, even briefly, want the suffering of the offender as a type of payback for the injury. It never gets involved at all in that type of magical thinking. It focuses on future well-being from the start, saying something should be done about that. It commits itself to a search for strategies, but it remains an open question whether the suffering of the offender will be among the most appealing. Now, this sort of borderline anger, I think it's not that common in many departments of life, but it's often felt by parents toward their young children. Namely, what the children have done is really outrageous, and something needs to be done about it, but the parents are not fully angry because they don't want to harm the child or strike back. They wish only good to ensue for the child. So that's a good example of what I have in mind. Now, what good could we say, on the other hand, about garden variety, ordinary anger? Anger, I think, has a very limited but real utility, which derives very likely from its evolutionary status as a fight or flight mechanism. It can, I think, play three roles. First, anger can be a useful signal, a wake-up call that something is badly wrong somewhere. Still, that signal has a lot of noise given anger's link to status. So when you feel it, it's not clear that something's really wrong. Second, anger can sometimes motivate people to address real problems. Again, however, it may not be the most reliable motivator. King said that he noticed that people came to the movement motivated by real anger, but he right away had to discipline and transform that emotion using the formal structures of the nonviolent protest march to transform it into something that would really prove governable and useful. Third, anger may be a useful deterrent People sometimes refrain from transgressing against people if they think an angry outburst is likely. Well, this may be true, but I don't think it's a very good way to relate to people in society, scaring them from treating you badly by being ungovernable and scary. We all know people like this, but they may only achieve isolation and not friendly treatment. More generally, the way anger deters is not likely to lead to a future of stability or peace. Instead, it's all too likely to lead to a more devious aggression. And there are many ways of deterring wrongdoing, some of which are much more attractive than inspiring fear of an explosion. In any case, we may retain these limited instrumental roles for anger while insisting that its payback fantasy is profoundly misleading, and that to the extent that it does make sense, as it does in the case of relative status, it does so against the background of diseased values. The emotion, in consequence, is highly likely to lead us astray. Well, what's the upshot of all this for law? In my larger project, I ask first about everyday justice and then about revolutionary justice. As far as everyday justice goes, the upshot, I think, is precisely what Jeremy Bentham and Plato before him thought. That is, the constructive, forward-looking thought about how to deal with the entire social problem of crime is what should interest us, not the empty fantasy of payback. Punishment, if we end up using it, ought to compete for our attention with other strategies, especially ex-ante strategies, for preventing wrongdoing. And thus the debate that's called the debate about the justification of punishment really ought to be a debate about how punishment at all measures up to other strategies a society can use ex ante to deter crime. As Bentham emphasized, preventing wrongful acts is a complicated task, and we need to consider it in the broadest possible way, asking how nutrition, social welfare, education, anti-discrimination policies, and a variety of other constructive policies may contribute. He argued that the focus on punishment ex post is actually quite inefficient if what one really wants is less offending. Often, he said, the same result can be attained, quote, as effectually at a cheaper rate by instruction, for instance, as well as by terror, by informing the understanding, as well as by exercising an immediate influence upon the will, end quote. At any rate, one must study the entire question, and it's a complicated empirical question, but most of the time, certainly in the United States, people are not considering it as a complicated empirical question. And I think we should agree with Bentham that the failure of societies to consider punishment in the context of a larger inquiry is a grotesque failure. It's as if parents stopped thinking about education, nutrition, aspiration, and love to focus single-mindedly on harsh treatment of the bad behavior that would surely result from such neglect. Parents don't behave that way because they love their children and they think of the children's well-being as part of their own. Unfortunately, citizens don't always love their fellow citizens or think of their well-being as a part of their own. And that, I fear, is why many modern societies, and perhaps the United States in particular, have been willing to tolerate mass incarceration and, in general, a pile-on-the-misery strategy as if it really made sense. Well, there's a lot more to be said about that, but no time here. Let me then turn to transitional justice, or return to it, because with Mandela we're there already. Philosophers and non-philosophers alike have often seen anger as appropriate in situations of great oppression, and is linked to the vindication of self-respect. It is then not surprising that non-anger in such situations should have struck many onlookers as strange, unmanly, even revolting. Consider the reaction of Webb Miller, the UPI correspondent who reported the nonviolent protest actions organized by Gandhi at the Dharasana salt works in 1930. Miller observed scores of marchers getting beaten down by the British police, 4 by 4, all day long. 4 would come up, they'd be clubbed down, dragged off, 4 more would come up, and so on. And he reacted with perplexity, as he records in a later memoir. Not one of the marchers, he writes, even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like 10-pins. From where I stood, I heard the sickening whacks of the clubs on unprotected skulls. At times, the spectacle of unresisting men being methodically bashed into a bloody pulp sickened me so much that I had to turn away. The Western mind finds it difficult to grasp the idea of non-resistance. I felt an indefinable sense of helpless rage and loathing, almost as much against the men who were submitting unresistingly to being beaten as against the police wielding the clubs, and this despite the fact that when I came to India, I sympathized with the Gandhi cause. While the marchers were not simply acquiescing, Miller could surely see that, their march was still a demand and a protest. They continued to march, and they chanted the slogan, "Long live the revolution." And yet, as Miller says, there's something in the mind, and I would venture to say probably not only the Western mind, that resists accepting this way of reacting to brutal behavior. What do Gandhi and King have to say to people who think that anger is the right response to oppressive behavior and the only response consistent with manly self-respect? First, they point out that the stance they recommend is anything but passive. Now, Gandhi, as you all I'm sure know, did initially endorse the English translation passive resistance for his idea, I think out of not sufficient awareness of how the English would be interpreted, but then eventually, quickly, when he understood that, he changed and said it was a bad translation. And both he and King continually insisted that what they recommend is a state of mind that is highly active, even, to use King's words, dynamically aggressive, in that it involves resistance to unjust conditions and protest against them. But when I say we should not resent, says Gandhi, I do not say that we should acquiesce. For King, similarly, quote, I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Both men hold, as I do, that anger is inherently wedded to a payback mentality. Gandhi says that resenting means wishing some harm to the opponent, even if only through divine agency. King similarly speaks of a strike-back mentality. So that's what they want to get rid of, and we'll soon see with what they replace it. Moreover, the new attitude is not just internally active, it issues in concrete actions with one's own body, actions that require considerable courage. King calls this direct action, action in which, after what he calls self-purification, that is, getting rid of the anger, one's own body is used to make the protest. This action is a forceful and uncompromising demand for freedom. The protester acts by marching, by breaking an unjust law, in a deliberate demand for justice, by refusing to cooperate with unjust authority. The goal, in King's case, was to force negotiations and to move toward legal and social change. For Gandhi, it was no less than to overthrow a wrongful government. The idea of acquiescence in brutality is presumably what revolted Webb Miller, but he just misunderstood. There's no acquiescence. There's a courageous struggle for a radical end. What is the new attitude with which they propose to replace anger? King, interestingly, allows a little scope for real anger at first, holding that demonstrations and marches are a way of channeling repressed emotions that might otherwise lead to violence. Nonetheless, even when it's real anger that brings people into the movement, it must soon be purified and lead to a focus on the future with hope and with faith in the possibility of justice. Meanwhile, anger toward opponents is to be transformed into a mental attitude that carefully separates the doer from the deed, criticizing and repudiating the bad deed, but never imputing unalterable evil to people. Deeds may be denounced, people always deserve respect and sympathy. After all, the ultimate goal, in King's words, is, quote, to create a world where men and women may live together, end quote. And that goal needs the cooperation of all. Above all, then, one should not wish to humiliate opponents in any way or wish them ill, but instead should seek to win their friendship and cooperation. Gandhi remarks that early in his career, he already felt that it was inappropriate to sing the second stanza of God Save the Queen, which asks God to scatter her enemies and make them fall, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. How can we assume, he says, that the enemies are knavish? Surely the believer in non-anger should not encourage such attitudes. The opponent is a person who's made a mistake, but we hope he can be won over by friendship and generosity. But now I want to turn to Mandela, whom we're all thinking of since his recent death and the excellent film about his life. And his ideas actually played a big role in my manuscript even before his death. So let me conclude with that example. I've argued that anger leads down two paths, either of which has an unattractive error built into it. Either anger's wish for ill to befall the wrongdoer is pointless, since payback does no good for the important elements of human flourishing that have been damaged, or it remains focused on relative status, in which case it may possibly succeed in its aim, relative abasement, but the aim itself is singularly unworthy. I'll now argue that Mandela instinctively makes these same distinctions and comes to the same conclusion, in a way informed by his study of Gandhi, but also shaped by his own life experience and his long period of self-examination during his 27 years in prison, a time that he says was extremely productive in meditating about anger. So what did Mandela realize in those long hours of what he calls in a late book of interviews and letters that he put together called Conversations with Myself? And he says that he took this title from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the Stoic philosopher, and we now know that there was actually a text of Marcus Aurelius in Robben Island in the prison. So it's an interesting question whether he knew those works there. So first, Mandela recognized, he says, that obsession with status is ubiquitous but unworthy. And so he refused to go down that road, although he used his understanding of that error to help him relate to other people. As for the wish for payback, he says he understands it very well and felt it deeply in his own life, but he recognized, he tells us, that payback simply doesn't get you anywhere. Maybe at some level you have a choice between anger and non-anger in the sense that wrongdoing might understandably and humanly ground either response. But if we ponder the sheer futility of the payback wish, and if we actually want good for ourselves and for others, we quickly discover that non-anger and a generous disposition are far more useful. Above all, says Mandela, they're far more useful for the person who is the fiduciary of a nation. To put it in a nutshell, a responsible leader has to look to the future, and anger is incompatible with forward-looking pragmatism. It just gets in the way. A good leader then must move to the transition as rapidly as possible, and perhaps for much of his life just stay there. A good summary of Mandela's approach can be found in a little parable that he told to his interviewer, Richard Stengel. And he said it was one he often used with his followers. So here's how it goes. I told the incident of an argument between the sun and the wind, that the sun said, I'm stronger than you are. And the wind said, no, I'm stronger than you are. And they decided, therefore, to test their strength with the traveler who was wearing a blanket. And they agreed that the one who would succeed in getting the traveler to get rid of the blanket would be the stronger. So the wind started. It started blowing, and the harder it blew, the tighter the traveler pulled the blanket about his body. And the wind blew and blew, but it could not get him to discard the blanket. And as I said, the harder the wind blew, the tighter the visitor tried to hold the blanket around his body. And the wind eventually gave up. Then the sun started with its rays, very mild, and they increased in strength. And as they increased, the traveler felt that the blanket was unnecessary, because the blanket is for warmth. And so he decided to relax it, to loosen it. But the rays of the sun became stronger and stronger, and eventually he threw it away. So By a gentle method, it was possible to get the traveler to discard his blanket. And this is the parable that through peace, you will be able to convert, you see, the most determined people. And this is the method that we must follow. Now, notice that Mandela frames the whole question in forward-looking, pragmatic terms as a question of getting the other party to do what you want. He then shows that this task is much more feasible if you can get the other party to work with you rather than against you. Progress is impeded by the other party's defensiveness and anxious self-protection. Anger, consequently, does nothing to move matters forward. It just increases the other party's anxiety and self-defensiveness. A gentle approach, by contrast, can gradually weaken defenses until the whole idea of self-defense is given up. Mandela, of course, was not naive, and he was not so ideological as to refuse reality. Thus, I think we would find him more pragmatic than Gandhi, who did entertain the thought of dropping armed resistance to Hitler and trying to convert Hitler by persuasion. Mandela's parable is offered in a particular context, that of the ending of a sometimes violent liberation struggle, with people on the other side, many of whom are genuine patriots who want the future good of the nation. He insisted from the start of his career that nonviolence should always be used only strategically. Still, behind the strategic resort to violence even, was always a view of people that was, in my terms, transitional, focused not on payback, but on the creation of a shared future in the wake of outrageous and terrible deeds. Two famous examples show Mandela checking the demands of his ANC comrades for payback in the service of reconciliation. The first is the famous example of rugby, known now through the excellent film Invictus with Morgan Freeman as Mandela, and based on John Carlin's book, which is actually much better than the film in the sense that it gives a much fuller account of what went on. So the ANC voted to decertify the South African rugby team as an official team of the nation in an attempt to punish the racist rugby community, since it had been an almost exclusively white sport, and the fans were pretty racist. Mandela understood the strategic importance of sports for reconciliation, and he set out to form a friendship with the team's captain and the other players, in the process also getting them to offer rugby clinics in the townships, and thus making it what it is by now, far less of an all-white sport. The celebration of the World Cup victory was the culmination of this long strategic campaign. And when the huge crowd in unison, black and white, chanted out Mandela's name, the future of the nation was one big step further on. The second related example was that of the national anthem. The ANC had voted to substitute their freedom hymn, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, for the old Afrikaans national anthem, Die Stem. Mandela saw that this would impede a future of reconciliation, so he proposed and convinced his party to accept the version that's now sung, in which the two anthems are put together with the final stanza in English. And actually, it's even more complicated because Nkosi is sung in 3 different African languages. Then we have the Afrikaans part, and then we have the final stanza in English. In both of these cases, payback was very natural and very easy. It just seemed right. Mandela preferred a more devious and difficult course. Although the ANC thought that their self-respect required payback, they later acknowledged that a generous spirit was both fully self-respecting and far more useful for the nation. So now I will end with just one more Mandela story, which I particularly like because it shows him at one and the same time renouncing the status error and the payback error. So Mandela is looking back. I mean, it's again an interview with Stengel. He's talking about an interaction with a white Afrikaner warder who watched him while he was in the transitional prison called Victor Vorster prior to his official release. He was in Robben Island, a really terrible prison for a very long time, then more briefly in Pollsmoor, a kind of middling prison. And then at the very end, when it was already known that he was going to be the next leader, he was in this very nice sort of country club-like prison called Victor Vorster, where he had his own personal cook, who was this Afrikaans jailer called Warders Svart. So the question now before them was how the dishes would get done, a question in many households all over the world. I took it upon myself to break the tension and a possible resentment on his part that he has to serve a prisoner by cooking and then washing dishes. And I offered to wash the dishes, and he refused. He says this is his work. I said, no, we must share it. Although he insisted and he was genuine, I forced him, literally forced him, to allow me to do the dishes. And we established a very good relationship. A really nice chap, Warders Svart, a very good friend of mine. Now, it would have been so easy to see this situation as one of status inversion. The dominating Afrikaner, the jailer, is now cooking and doing dishes for the once despised ANC leader. It would also have been so easy to see it in terms of payback. The warder is getting a humiliation he deserves because of his complicity in racial oppression. Significantly, Mandela doesn't go down either of these doomed paths, even briefly. He's asking only, how shall I produce cooperation and friendship? It was this remarkable capacity for generosity and reciprocity that was Mandela's genius, the fruit, as he tells us, of years of critical self-examination on Robben Island. It's a very difficult goal, but it's that goal that I am recommending for both individuals and institutions. Anger is a prominent part of most people's lives. I've argued that it lacks the virtues often claimed for it and has both normative and practical problems all its own. I hesitate to conclude with a slogan that surely betrays my age, but it really does seem time to give peace a chance.